Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we journey to Canada's last frontier, where the permafrost holds more than ice and the endless winter darkness conceals horrors that defy explanation. The Yukon Territory, a land of isolated communities separated by hundreds of frozen miles, where help is often impossibly far away and the line between reality and nightmare grows dangerously thin. In these 10 accounts, you will hear from those who survived encounters with stalkers emerging from the wilderness, voices that call from abandoned mines, and vanishings that leave investigators with nothing but questions and dread. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are recent testimonies from ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by what lurks in Canada's frozen north. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Yukon small towns, where civilization ends and terror begins. I am a man in my mid-30s, and this happened to me in the winter of 2023. And I still get this sick feeling in my stomach whenever I think about how close I came to becoming another unsolved missing person case in the Yukon. It is kind of embarrassing to admit now, but at the time I was so desperate for human connection in that isolated place that I ignored every red flag. I can look back on it now with my wife and talk about how naive I was, but it was absolutely terrifying at the time. It started when I moved to Dawson City for work. I had been hired as a mechanic at a small mining equipment repair shop that serviced the exploration operations scattered throughout the territory. The pay was excellent, and I needed a fresh start after my divorce, so I packed up my truck and made the long drive north. Dawson City is not like anywhere else I have ever lived. The population hovers around 1,300 people, and during the deep winter months, it feels even smaller. The sun barely rises above the horizon, and temperatures regularly drop to minus 40 degrees. Everyone knows everyone, and strangers stand out immediately. I rented a small apartment above one of the old storefronts on Front Street, and I threw myself into my work. The shop specialized in repairing crushers, conveyor systems, and the heavy machinery used in hard rock mining operations. Most of our clients were exploration companies working remote claims, accessible only by winter ice roads. It was hard physical work, but I enjoyed the challenge and the craftsmanship required. The owner, an older man named Frank, ran a tight operation and did not tolerate sloppy repairs. He used to say that out here, equipment failure in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean someone freezing to death waiting for a rescue that might take days. After about 2 months, I started noticing one customer who came in more frequently than others. His name was James, or at least that is what he told me. He was probably in his late 40s, with a weathered face and the kind of beard that men grow when they spend most of their time in the bush. He owned a small placer mining operation about 60 kilometers outside town, and he was always bringing in equipment that needed welding or parts replacement. Unlike most of our clients who dropped off equipment and left, James would hang around the shop and chat while I worked. At first, I found it a bit annoying, but I was so starved for social interaction that I eventually started looking forward to his visits. James seemed friendly enough. He would tell stories about living off the grid, about the wildlife he encountered, about the challenges of mining in permafrost. He asked about my background, about why I had moved north, and I found myself opening up to him more than I probably should have. I told him about my divorce, about wanting to disappear for a while, about how I did not have any family or friends who knew exactly where I was. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous that information was to share, but at the time it just felt good to talk to someone who seemed to understand. One day in late January, James came into the shop and invited me to go ice fishing with him that weekend. He said he knew a great spot on the Yukon River where the burbot were biting, and that I needed to experience a real northern winter activity. I hesitated at first because I had never been ice fishing before, but he insisted it would be fun and that he had all the gear I would need. The idea of getting out of town and doing something other than working and sitting alone in my apartment was appealing, so I agreed. He told me to meet him at the Chevron station on the Klondike Highway at 8 in the morning on Saturday. That Saturday morning was brutally cold. The temperature was minus 38 degrees, and there was ice fog hanging in the air. I almost talked myself out of going, but I did not want to be rude, and I figured James knew what he was doing. He pulled up in his truck right on time, a white Ford with a camper shell on the back. We headed north out of town, and after about 45 minutes, he turned off onto what he said was an old mining road. The snow was deep but packed down, and his truck handled it easily. As we drove further from the highway, I started noticing that he kept glancing at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. He asked me again whether I had told anyone where I was going. I laughed it off and said no, that I did not really know anyone in town yet. He nodded slowly and said that it was good to be careful about who you trusted up here. The comment struck me as odd given that he was essentially a stranger himself, but I pushed the feeling aside. After about an hour of driving deeper into the wilderness, we came upon an abandoned gold dredge sitting frozen in an old creek bed. The massive rusted structure looked like something from another era, and James parked his truck nearby. He said the fishing spot was just a short walk from here, down on the frozen river. I got out of the truck and immediately the cold hit me like a physical force. It was so quiet out there that I could hear the snow creaking under my boots. James went to the back of his truck to get the fishing gear, and I walked over to look at the old dredge. That is when I noticed something that made my blood run cold despite the temperature. Through the rear window of the camper shell, I could see equipment that had nothing to do with fishing. There were zip ties, rolls of duct tape, coils of heavy rope, and what looked like a tarp folded up. There was also a jerry can and some tools that seemed out of place for a fishing trip. My heart started pounding, and my mind raced through everything James had asked me over the past months. He knew I was alone. He knew no one knew where I was. He knew I had no family checking on me. He had specifically confirmed that morning that I had not told anyone about our trip. This was not a fishing trip. This was something else entirely. I forced myself to stay calm and walked back around to where James was pulling gear out of the truck. I needed to act normal while I figured out how to get out of this situation. I asked him casually where exactly the fishing spot was, and he pointed down toward the river, which I could barely see through the trees. He said it was about a 10-minute walk through the bush. There was no trail, no one around for dozens of kilometers, and temperatures that would kill me in hours if I ran without proper preparation. I pretended to adjust my boot and pulled out my phone, praying I had some kind of signal. I had one bar. I made a show of checking something on my phone and then said loudly, so James could hear, that I needed to update my location sharing with my coworker Frank because he got worried if I did not check in every few hours since that incident last month. There had been no incident, and I had never shared my location with Frank. But James did not know that. I watched his face carefully. His friendly expression shifted slightly, and his eyes narrowed. He asked what kind of incident, and I made up a story about getting stuck on a back road and Frank having to come pull me out. I said Frank insisted I use that phone tracking feature whenever I went out of town now, and that he would call the RCMP if I did not update it regularly. I added that it was annoying, but Frank was paranoid after some prospector went missing last year and was not found for 3 weeks. The change in James was immediate and unsettling. He became very quiet and started putting the gear back into his truck. He said that actually he had forgotten he had something he needed to take care of back at his claim, and maybe we should reschedule the fishing trip. His hands were shaking slightly as he closed the camper shell, and he would not make eye contact with me anymore. The drive back to town was the longest hour of my life. Neither of us spoke. James drove faster than he had on the way out, and I kept my hand in my pocket gripping my phone the entire time. I had texted Frank from the truck, just a simple message asking if he was around, anything to create a digital trail. When we finally reached the Chevron station, I thanked James for his time and got into my truck as quickly as I could without running. He drove off toward the north without saying goodbye. I went straight to the RCMP detachment in Dawson City and told them everything. The officer I spoke with took my statement seriously and said they would look into it. He mentioned that James was not unknown to them and that he had been questioned years ago in connection with a missing person case that was never solved. The person had disappeared after telling coworkers they were going ice fishing with someone, but no one had ever been able to prove James was involved. The RCMP tried to locate James over the following weeks, but he had vanished. His truck was eventually found abandoned near the Alaska border, and his mining claim was deserted. They searched the area where he had taken me, but found nothing conclusive. To this day, I do not know what James had planned for me that day, but I am absolutely certain that if I had not seen that equipment in his truck and invented that story about location tracking, I would not have made it back to Dawson City. I finished out my contract at the shop, but I could not stay in Dawson after that. Every truck that pulled up made me nervous, and I kept wondering if James would come back. I moved back south that spring and eventually met my wife, who knows the whole story. She says I was smart to trust my instincts, but I know it was mostly luck. The Yukon is a beautiful place, but it is also a place where people can disappear without a trace, and where help is often too far away to matter. I think about that often, especially when I hear about another missing person case from up north. I wonder how many of those people met someone like James, and I wonder how many others are still out there, waiting in the frozen wilderness for their next opportunity. I am a woman in my late 20s, and this happened to me last summer in 2024, and it still terrifies me to the point where I have trouble sleeping through the night. I know how insane this sounds, and I have tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways, but there is no logical explanation for what happened to me in Mayo. I am a researcher by training, and I approach everything with skepticism, but what I experienced in the Yukon has shaken my understanding of reality. I can talk about it now, but only because I am hundreds of kilometers away and I refuse to ever go back. It started when I received a grant to document oral histories from indigenous elders in central Yukon. I had been working on my graduate research focused on traditional knowledge systems and language preservation, and this opportunity to spend a month in Mayo conducting interviews seemed perfect for my thesis. Mayo is a small village of about 200 people located along the Stewart River, originally established during the silver mining boom of the early 1900s. It serves as the service center for the area, with most of the population being members of the Na-Cha-O-Nyak-Dun First Nation. The landscape around Mayo is stunning but harsh, with endless boreal forest, countless abandoned mines, and a sense of isolation that is difficult to describe unless you have experienced it. I arrived in early July when the days were incredibly long and the sun barely set. The light at that time of year is strange, creating this perpetual twilight that messes with your sense of time. I had arranged to rent a small cabin about 5 kilometers outside the village, down an old access road that led toward the McIntyre Creek area. The cabin belonged to someone who used it as a hunting camp, and they were happy to have someone staying there and keeping an eye on the place. It was basic but comfortable, with a wood stove, a generator for electricity, and a well for water. The nearest neighbor was over 2 kilometers away. The first few days were wonderful. I spent my time in the village meeting with elders and arranging interview sessions. Everyone I met was warm and welcoming, though I noticed that when I mentioned where I was staying, some of the older people would get this look on their faces. One elder woman named Margaret asked me very directly whether I had been to the old mine workings near the cabin. I told her I had seen them from a distance but had not explored them. She told me firmly that I should stay away from there, especially at night. When I asked why, she said that place had taken people and that the ground there was not right. She would not elaborate further, and I assumed she was referring to safety concerns about unstable tunnels or environmental contamination. The strange experiences began on my 4th night in the cabin. I had spent the day transcribing interviews, and I went to bed around midnight, which still felt early because of the lingering twilight. I fell asleep, easily enough, but sometime in the night I woke up suddenly with the overwhelming sense that someone was singing. The sound was beautiful and haunting, a kind of melodic chanting in a language I did not recognize. It was not Gwich'in or Northern Tuchone, the languages I had been hearing in my interviews. It was something else entirely, with these rising and falling tones that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. I sat up in bed and realized the singing was coming from outside, somewhere in the direction of the old mine. I looked at my phone and it was 3:17 in the morning. The rational part of my brain said it must be someone camping in the area, maybe practicing traditional songs. But the sound had this quality that did not seem quite real, like it was coming from very far away and very close at the same time. I listened for probably 10 minutes before it faded away, and I fell back asleep. The next morning I felt strangely exhausted, like I had not slept at all. I mentioned the singing to one of my interview subjects later that day, and he became very serious. He asked me to describe exactly what I had heard, and when I did, he shook his head and said I needed to talk to Margaret again. When I found Margaret, she invited me into her home and made tea. She asked me whether I had gone outside during the night, and I said no, I had only listened from my bed. She looked relieved but told me I needed to be very careful. She said the old mine had spirits that called to people, and that those who answered the call often disappeared or came back changed. I should have packed up and moved to the village right then, but I am stubborn, and I did not want to seem like I was disrespecting their beliefs or being a typical scared outsider. I told myself it was just local folklore meant to keep people away from dangerous areas. That night, I made sure all my doors and windows were locked before I went to bed. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I felt genuinely afraid for the first time. I woke up standing outside my cabin in my nightgown. The morning air was cold, and I was barefoot on the rough gravel. My heart was pounding, and I had absolutely no memory of leaving my bed, unlocking the door, or walking outside. I stumbled back inside and checked the time. It was 4:03 in the morning. I examined the door, and it was unlocked, which made no sense because I distinctly remembered locking it. I had never sleepwalked in my entire life, and the idea that I had done so now seemed impossible. I tried to convince myself it was stress or the strange light cycle affecting my sleep patterns, but I felt sick with fear. I called my supervisor back in Vancouver and explained that I was having some issues and might need to come back early. She told me to take care of myself and that the research could wait, but I had traveled so far and worked so hard to set up these interviews that I decided to stay a bit longer. I would just be more careful. That day, I went to the village and bought a length of rope. Back at the cabin, I tied one end around my ankle and the other end to the heavy iron bed frame. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I needed to know that I could not leave the cabin in my sleep again. I also set my phone to record audio through the night, thinking that if I was sleepwalking and sleep-talking, maybe I could figure out what was triggering it. I went to bed that night terrified of what might happen. I must have fallen asleep around midnight, and when I woke up, it was to the sensation of cold dirt under my feet and the smell of earth and rot. I was standing at the entrance of the old mine shaft near my cabin. The sun was just beginning to rise, and I could see the dark opening of the tunnel in front of me. I looked down and saw that the rope around my ankle had snapped. It had not come untied. It had broken, with the frayed ends showing that something had pulled it apart with tremendous force. I have never run faster in my life than I did getting back to that cabin. I was sobbing, and my feet were bleeding from the rocks and roots I had stumbled over. Once inside, I locked every door and window and shoved furniture against the door. I looked at my phone and saw that it had recorded for over 4 hours. I did not want to listen to it, but I needed to know what had happened. The recording started with normal silence, just the sounds of the cabin settling and the wind outside. Then around 3 in the morning, I could hear the singing again, that same beautiful haunting melody. A few minutes later, I heard myself get out of bed. I heard my own voice, but I was not speaking English. I was responding to the singing in that same unknown language, speaking words I had never learned and could not possibly know. I heard the door unlock and open. I heard my footsteps walking away from the cabin. The recording continued for another hour, just wind and distant sounds, before it ended when the phone battery died. I sat there listening to my own voice speaking in a language I did not know, and I realized that whatever was in that mine had been calling me for days. It had pulled me from my bed, snapped a thick rope, and drawn me to the entrance of those dark tunnels. I looked at my hands and saw that my fingernails were packed with dirt, and there was soil on my nightgown. I had been digging or crawling, and I had no memory of any of it. I did not even pack properly. I threw my essential belongings into my car and drove straight to the village. I found Margaret and played her the recording. She listened to me speaking in that unknown language, and her face went pale. She said that was old language from before the current people, and that I was very lucky to have woken up when I did. She said the mine had been trying to take me below, and that if I had gone deeper into the tunnels, I would never have found my way back out. She performed a cleansing ceremony for me and gave me something to wear around my neck for protection. She told me I needed to leave Mayo and not come back. I drove to Whitehorse that same day and caught the first flight I could get back to Vancouver. I never went back for the rest of my belongings in the cabin. I told the owner to keep them or throw them away. I did not care. I abandoned my research project entirely and changed my thesis topic to something that could be done entirely in libraries. My supervisor was understanding when I told her I had experienced something traumatic, though I never explained the full details. The worst part is that it did not completely stop. For months after I returned home, I would wake up with this overwhelming urge to go back, not just to Mayo or the Yukon, but specifically to that mine. I would wake up standing at my apartment door with my hand on the doorknob, or I would catch myself looking up directions to drive north. I started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma, and slowly the compulsion faded, but it has never completely gone away. There are still nights when I wake up and hear that singing in my dreams, and I feel that same pull to answer it, to walk into the darkness and never come back. I did some research after I got home and found historical records about the McIntyre Creek mines. There had been disappearances in that area going back decades. Miners who wandered away from camp and were never found. Prospectors whose bodies were never recovered. Even a search and rescue worker in the 1990s who went into one of the tunnels and had to be forcibly removed by his team because he kept trying to go deeper, claiming he could hear someone calling for help, but there was never anyone down there. I do not know what is in those mines. Maybe it is something geological, some kind of gas or mineral that causes hallucinations and compulsive behavior. Maybe it is something from indigenous tradition that I do not understand and have no right to speak about. Or maybe it is something else entirely, something that defies conventional explanation. All I know is that whatever called to me from those dark tunnels was real, and it wanted me to come down into the earth and never leave. I was lucky to escape, and I think about the others who were not so lucky. I think about them down there in the darkness, still answering the call, still digging deeper. I am a man in my early 40s, and this happened to me last fall in 2024, and it has fundamentally changed how I feel about driving the routes I have traveled for over 15 years. I know how this sounds, and I have debated whether to share this at all, but after talking to other truckers who drive the same stretches of highway, I learned that I am far from the only person who has experienced this. It is still deeply unsettling to think about, and there are certain sections of road I now refuse to drive at night no matter how much the company offers to pay me. I am a long-haul trucker, and I have been driving routes between Whitehorse and the Alaska border for the past 16 years. The Klondike Highway is my regular run, a stretch of road that covers over 700 kilometers through some of the most isolated territory in North America. During the summer months, the highway is busy with tourists heading to Dawson City and into Alaska, but in the fall and winter, it can be hours between vehicles. The landscape is stunning but unforgiving, with dense boreal forest, frozen rivers, and mountains that seem to go on forever. Cell phone coverage is spotty at best, and if you break down in the wrong place during winter, you could be in serious trouble before help arrives. I have always enjoyed the solitude of these drives. There is something meditative about the endless road, the rhythm of the kilometers passing, the northern lights dancing overhead on clear nights. I've seen wolves, caribou, grizzly bears, and moose. I've driven through blizzards and temperatures that made my diesel fuel gel despite the additives. I thought I had experienced everything these northern highways had to offer, but I was wrong. It happened on a run in late October. I was heading north from Whitehorse toward Dawson City with a load of supplies for one of the mining operations. I had left around 6 in the evening, planning to make it to Dawson by early morning. The sun had set hours earlier and the highway was empty. The temperature had dropped to around -15, and there was fresh snow on the road, nothing I could not handle but enough to keep my speed down and my attention focused. I was about 40 kilometers past Carmax, which is a small village roughly halfway between Whitehorse and Dawson, when I saw her standing on the side of the highway. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me because it made no sense for anyone to be out there on foot. But as my headlights got closer, I could clearly see a young woman with her thumb out, hitchhiking. She was wearing what looked like a long wool coat and a knit hat, and she was not moving around or stamping her feet the way someone would if they were trying to stay warm in that cold. Now, I generally do not pick up hitchhikers. It is against company policy, and frankly, it is dangerous for both parties these days. But out there in the middle of nowhere, with temperatures that could kill someone in a couple of hours, I could not just drive past her. I pulled over, and she walked up to the passenger side of the cab. I rolled down the window and asked if she needed help, if her vehicle had broken down somewhere nearby. She did not say anything, just opened the door and climbed up into the cab. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was not unpleasant exactly, but it was distinct. Wood smoke, very strong, like she had been standing next to a campfire for hours. The second thing I noticed was her clothing. The coat she wore looked handmade, and the style seemed old-fashioned somehow. But what really struck me was her expression. She just stared straight ahead through the windshield, completely blank, like she was not really seeing anything. I asked her where she was heading and whether she was okay. No response. I asked if she had been in an accident or if someone else needed help. Nothing. She just sat there staring forward, with her hands folded in her lap. I could see now that her skin was very pale, and there was something off about the way the shadows fell on her face, like the interior lights of the cab were not quite reaching her properly. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I told her I was heading to Dawson and that I could take her as far as Pelly Crossing or wherever she needed to go. She did not acknowledge me at all. I thought maybe she was in shock from exposure or trauma, so I cranked up the heat and got the truck back on the road. I figured once we got to Pelly Crossing, I could get her to the nursing station and let them deal with whatever was going on. The drive was incredibly uncomfortable. She never moved, never blinked that I could see, just stared ahead with that blank expression. I tried making small talk about the weather and the route, anything to fill the oppressive silence, but she gave no indication she could even hear me. The smell of wood smoke got stronger as we drove, filling the entire cab. I cracked my window, despite the cold, just to get some fresh air circulating. About 30 minutes down the road, I needed to check something in my logbook. I took my eyes off the road for maybe 5 seconds to glance at the paperwork on my clipboard. When I looked up, I instinctively glanced over at the passenger seat to make sure she was still okay. The seat was empty, completely empty. The door had never opened. I'd not heard anything. She had simply vanished. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a stop on the snowy highway. My heart was pounding and I could not process what had just happened. I turned on the interior lights and checked the entire cab. No one was there. The passenger door was still locked from the inside, exactly as it had been since she got in. There were no footprints in the frost that had formed on the outside of the windows. The only evidence she had been there at all was the lingering smell of wood smoke and a slight dampness on the passenger seat, like snow had melted there. I sat there for probably 20 minutes trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had been more tired than I thought. Maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing due to fatigue or carbon monoxide somehow getting into the cab. But the smell was real, and the wet seat was real, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had picked someone up. I eventually got the truck moving again, but I kept glancing at the passenger seat every few seconds, half expecting her to reappear. When I got to Pelly Crossing about an hour later, I stopped at the gas station and went inside. I must have looked pretty shaken because the woman working there asked if I was all right. I told her what had happened, expecting her to look at me like I was crazy. Instead, her expression became very serious, and she asked me to describe the woman. When I told her about the old-fashioned coat and the blank stare and the smell of wood smoke, she nodded slowly. She told me I had picked up the Klondike ghost, and the truckers and drivers had been reporting the same experience for decades. She said the woman I described matched the accounts almost exactly. According to local knowledge, she was a young woman who died in a car accident somewhere along that stretch of highway back in 1987. Her car had gone off the road during a winter storm, and she had tried to walk for help but froze to death. They did not find her body until spring. Ever since then, drivers report picking her up on cold nights, and she always vanishes without a trace before reaching Pelly Crossing. I went back to my truck, feeling even more unsettled than before. I finished the drive to Dawson, dropped off my load, and headed back to Whitehorse. On the return trip, I drove past the spot where I'd picked her up. It was just a stretch of highway like any other, nothing to mark it as special or significant, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few weeks, I asked other truckers who run the northern routes whether they had ever experienced anything strange. More than a few admitted they had picked up the same hitchhiker over the years. Some described her exactly as I had seen her. Others said she appeared different, but always vanished in the same way. One driver told me he had picked her up 3 separate times over a span of 10 years, always in the same area, always in late fall or winter. The worst part came about a month later. I was making another run to Dawson, and I was passing through Carmack's around midnight. As I drove through the village, I glanced in my rear view mirror to check my trailer. That is when I saw her sitting in the passenger seat behind me, visible in the reflection. The same woman, the same blank expression staring forward. I jerked my head around to look at the actual passenger seat, and it was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. Since then, I see her regularly in my mirrors when I drive, that route at night. She is never there when I turn to look directly, only in the reflections. Sometimes she is sitting in the passenger seat. Sometimes she is standing at the side of the road as I pass. I have started to recognize the locations where she appears most frequently. Other drivers I have talked to say the same thing happens to them once they pick her up the first time. It is like she marks you somehow, and after that she becomes a regular passenger on your northern runs. I tried explaining this to my dispatcher and asking to be moved to different routes, but they told me I was being superstitious and that the northern runs pay too well to give up over ghost stories. So I continue driving the Klondike Highway. But I never stop for hitchhikers anymore, no matter how desperate their situation might appear. And I try not to look in my mirrors more than necessary when I drive past Carmack's late at night. My wife thinks the isolation and long hours are getting to me, and maybe she is right. But I know what I saw and what I continue to see. That woman died alone on a frozen highway decades ago, and for some reason she is still out there, still trying to get wherever she was going that night. I do not know if she is asking for help or warning drivers about something, or simply replaying her final hours over and over. All I know is that the Klondike Highway has its own passengers, and they do not always leave when you think they should. I am a woman in my early 30s, and this happened to me in the spring of 2024, and I am still receiving counseling for the violation I felt and the fear that consumed my life for months afterward. It is humiliating to admit how naive I was and how completely I misjudged someone who lived right next door to me. I can talk about it now because he is in custody and I have moved far away. But there are still nights when I wake up convinced someone is in my apartment, going through my things while I sleep. It started when I relocated to Watson Lake to teach at the elementary school. I had been working as a teacher in Vancouver for 5 years, but I was burned out on the city and wanted a complete change of pace. When the position in Watson Lake came up, offering a significant salary increase and the chance to experience life in a small northern community, I applied immediately. Watson Lake is a town of about 200 people, located at the junction of the Alaska Highway and the Robert Campbell Highway in southeastern Yukon. It is known for the signpost forest, where travelers have been posting signs from their hometown since 1942, and for being the gateway community to the territory. I arrived in early March when there was still deep snow on the ground and temperatures hovering around -20. The school arranged housing for me in a duplex on the edge of town. It was a newer building, well insulated and comfortable, with my unit on one side and another tenant on the other. The duplex was owned by a local family who lived elsewhere in town, so I would not be living with a landlord watching my every move. I was excited about the independence and the chance to settle into this new chapter of my life. My neighbor introduced himself the day I moved in. His name was Benjamin, and he seemed friendly and helpful. He was probably in his mid-40s, worked at the airport doing maintenance, and had lived in Watson Lake for about 3 years. He helped me carry some boxes from my truck and gave me advice about where to shop, which restaurants were good, and what winter gear I would need. He mentioned that he kept odd hours because of his work schedule, so I should not worry if I heard him coming and going at strange times. I appreciated the heads up and thought it was considerate of him to mention it. Over the first few weeks, Benjamin continued to be the model neighbor. He would clear snow from both sides of the driveway without being asked. He brought over firewood when I mentioned I was planning to use the wood stove. When my truck would not start one particularly cold morning, he came over with jumper cables and got me running in time for school. I felt lucky to have landed next to someone so helpful, especially in a place where I did not know anyone yet. The school year was going well. I was teaching a combined 2nd and 3rd grade class, and the kids were wonderful. The community was welcoming, and I was starting to feel like I had made the right decision moving north. I threw myself into my work and started exploring the area on weekends. Watson Lake was more isolated than I had anticipated, with Whitehorse being over 400 kilometers to the west and Fort Nelson being the nearest town of any size in British Columbia, about 300 kilometers to the southeast. But I found the isolation peaceful rather than oppressive. About 6 weeks after I moved in, I started noticing that Benjamin seemed to know things about my schedule that I did not remember telling him. He would mention that I must have had a late night grading papers because he saw my light on past midnight. He knew when I had gone to Whitehorse for the weekend before I had mentioned the trip. He commented on groceries I had bought, asking if I was planning to try making bannock because he noticed I had picked up lard and flour. At first, I thought maybe I was just forgetting our conversations, or that he was simply observant in the way people are in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. Then I started noticing that small things in my apartment were not quite where I had left them. A book on my coffee table would be at a slightly different angle. The kitchen chairs would be pushed in more neatly than I remembered leaving them. My bathroom cabinet door would be closed, when I was certain I had left it open. Each incident was minor enough that I could convince myself I was misremembering, but the cumulative effect was deeply unsettling. I began to feel watched, even when I was alone in my apartment. The breaking point came when I could not find my spare key. I kept a spare on a hook inside my coat closet, hidden behind some jackets. I had checked on it a week earlier, and it had been there. But when I went to look for it one evening, it was gone. I tore apart the closet and searched the entire apartment but could not find it anywhere. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. If someone had taken my spare key, they could enter my apartment whenever they wanted. I decided to test my suspicion in a way that would give me concrete evidence. I set up my phone on a shelf in my living room, positioned to record the front door and the main living area. I made sure it was plugged in so it would not run out of battery, and I set it to record video. Then I went to school as usual. I deliberately mentioned to Benjamin that morning that I had parent-teacher conferences that evening and would not be home until after 6. When I got home that evening, my hands were shaking as I retrieved my phone and reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing, just my empty apartment and the afternoon light fading through the windows. Then at 4:47, I watched my front door unlock and open. Benjamin walked into my apartment as casually as if it were his own. He looked around slowly, walked through my living room, and went into my bedroom. I could not see what he was doing in there because the camera angle did not reach that far, but he was in there for almost 10 minutes. When he came back to the living room, he opened my desk drawer and went through some of my papers. He picked up framed photos I had on my bookshelf and examined them closely. He opened my laptop, but it must have been password protected because he closed it after a moment. Then he sat on my couch for several minutes, just looking around my apartment like he was memorizing every detail. Before he left, he walked over to the shelf where my phone was recording, and for one terrible moment, I thought he had spotted the camera. But he was looking at the books on the shelf, running his fingers along their spines. Then he left, locking the door behind him. I felt physically sick watching the video. This man I had trusted, who had been so helpful and friendly, had been entering my home without permission and going through my most private spaces. I had no idea how many times he had done this, or what he had been looking for or taking. The violation was overwhelming, and I started crying right there on my couch, but I knew I needed to act quickly before he realized I was onto him. I called the RCMP detachment immediately and explained what had happened. 2 officers came to my apartment within the hour, and I showed them the video. They took my statement and said they would confront Benjamin, but that I should pack a bag and stay elsewhere for the night in case the situation escalated. I went to stay with another teacher from the school who had become a friend, and I barely slept that night. The next morning, the RCMP told me they had searched Benjamin's apartment and found things that made my blood run cold. He had created a shrine to me in one of his closets. There were dozens of photographs of me that he had taken without my knowledge, printed out, and pinned to the walls. There were items he had stolen from my apartment over the months, personal things like a hair tie, a coffee mug I had thought I lost, even a t-shirt I slept in. He had notebooks filled with observations about my routine, what I wore, who I talked to, what time I went to bed each night. The RCMP also discovered that this was not his first offense. Benjamin had been fired from a previous job in Fort St. John, British Columbia, for stalking a female co-worker. He had been issued a restraining order in that case, but had never faced criminal charges because the woman had been too frightened to pursue the case fully. He had moved to Watson Lake shortly after that incident. And apparently, I was not his first target here either. 2 other women in town had reported feeling like someone had been in their homes when they were away, but there had never been enough evidence to prove anything. Benjamin was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including breaking and entering theft, criminal harassment, and possession of stolen property. During questioning, he admitted that he had been obsessed with me since the day I moved in. He said he had made a copy of my spare key the first time I had invited him in for coffee in those early weeks. He had been entering my apartment several times a week, whenever he knew I would be at school or away from home. He would go through my belongings, read my journal, look at my photos, and sometimes just sit in my space surrounded by my things. The most chilling detail came when the RCMP told me that based on the volume of photos and observations in his apartment, he had been planning something more serious. They found internet searches on his computer about how to disable smoke alarms, the effects of different sedatives, and isolated locations around Watson Lake where someone could be taken without being seen. The officer told me frankly that if I had not caught him when I did with that video evidence, they believed he would have eventually escalated from stalking to abduction or worse. The duplex owner was horrified when they learned what had happened and offered to let me break my lease without penalty. But I could not stay in Watson Lake at all after that. Every time I saw Benjamin's empty apartment or walked past the places where he had followed me without my knowledge, I felt sick. I finished out the school year, but I requested a transfer and moved to a teaching position in Whitehorse that fall. Even there, almost 500 kilometers away, I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder and feeling paranoid about new neighbors. Benjamin pleaded guilty to avoid trial, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by probation with strict conditions. The Crown prosecutor told me that the video evidence I had collected was crucial to securing the conviction, and that my quick thinking had likely prevented him from hurting me or someone else. But I do not feel brave or clever. I feel violated and stupid for not seeing the signs earlier. I have learned that predators like Benjamin are skilled at presenting themselves as helpful and trustworthy. They integrate themselves into your life slowly, earning your confidence before revealing their true intentions. The isolation of small northern communities can make people particularly vulnerable because everyone is so dependent on neighbors for help, and there is a culture of trust that predators exploit. I still teach, and I love my work, but I will never be as trusting as I was before Watson Lake. I change my locks immediately when I move anywhere new. I never give anyone a spare key, not even friends. I have cameras in my apartment that I monitor from my phone, and I pay attention to those small signs that something is not quite right, because ignoring those instincts almost cost me everything. I am a man in my late 20s, and this happened to me in the winter of 2023, and it has completely changed my relationship with the wilderness I once loved. I know this will sound unbelievable, and I have struggled with whether to share this story at all because I understand how insane it sounds. I am a rational person with a degree in environmental science and years of experience working in remote areas, but what I encountered near Cluane Lake defies every logical explanation I have tried to apply to it. I still have nightmares about it, and I refuse to go back to that area alone. I work as a wildlife photographer, specializing in northern landscapes and aurora photography. I have spent years traveling throughout the Yukon and Alaska capturing images of the wilderness, and I've always felt comfortable in isolated environments. In December 2023, I planned a solo camping trip to Cluane Lake to photograph the northern lights during the new moon, when the skies would be darkest and the aurora most visible. Cluane Lake is the largest lake entirely within the Yukon Territory, spanning about 400 square kilometers and located roughly 60 kilometers northwest of Haines Junction. The area is known for its stunning mountain scenery and pristine wilderness. I arrived at a remote access point along the Alaska Highway on a clear evening when the temperature was hovering around minus 28 degrees. I set up my cold weather camping gear on the frozen lakeshore, about a kilometer from the highway down an old trail. The location was perfect, with an unobstructed view of the northern sky and minimal light pollution. The sun had set around 4:30 in the afternoon, and I had hours of darkness ahead to capture the aurora if it appeared. By 8 in the evening, the northern lights began their display. Ribbons of green and purple light danced across the sky, undulating and shifting in patterns that never ceased to amaze me, no matter how many times I witnessed them. I set up my camera equipment and began shooting long exposures, periodically checking my shots and adjusting my settings. The silence out there was absolute except for the occasional crack of ice on the lake settling in the cold. I was in my element, completely focused on my work. Around 10:30, I took a break to warm my hands and have some hot coffee from my thermos. I happened to glance out across the frozen lake, and I noticed something that had not been there before. About 300 meters out on the ice, there was a dark figure standing completely motionless. My first thought was that another photographer had arrived and set up out on the lake for a different perspective. But something about the shape seemed wrong. The figure was too tall and too narrow, and it was not wearing any visible winter gear that I could make out despite the extreme cold. I grabbed my telephoto lens and aimed it at the figure to get a better look. What I saw through the viewfinder made my stomach drop. It was humanoid in shape, but the proportions were incorrect. The limbs were too long for the torso, and the head seemed too small. It was standing in a position that looked uncomfortable, with its arms hanging at odd angles and its legs slightly bent. But the most disturbing aspect was that it appeared to be covered in frost or ice, like it had been out there for days in the elements. Yet it was clearly standing upright and appeared to be facing my direction. I lowered my camera and looked with my naked eyes, and the figure was still there in the same position. I told myself it must be a stump or some kind of ice formation that I was misinterpreting in the darkness, but I knew the lake surface. I had studied this area in daylight before making camp, and there had been nothing out there. The ice was relatively smooth and clear of obstacles. I decided to keep an eye on it while I continued photographing the aurora. For the next hour, I would glance out at the figure periodically, and it had not moved at all, not even a slight shift in position. No human being could stand motionless in minus 28-degree weather for over an hour. I began to feel deeply uneasy, but I tried to focus on my work and ignore it. Then around midnight, I looked out again and felt my blood turn cold. The figure had moved. It was no longer 300 meters away. It was now approximately 150 meters from my camp, standing in a new location on the ice. But I had not seen it move. I had not looked away from that area for more than a few minutes at a time, and there was no way something could have covered that distance across open ice without me noticing movement. I grabbed my telephoto lens again and zoomed in on the figure. Through the lens, I could see details that terrified me. The figure was definitely humanoid, but it was not human. Its surface appeared to be solid ice, like a person who had been frozen solid, but was somehow still standing. The face, if it could be called that, had rough indentations where eyes and a mouth might be, but no clear features. Frost crystals covered its entire form, glittering in the ambient light from my camp and the aurora overhead. I put down my camera and made a decision. I needed to leave immediately. Every instinct I had was screaming that I was in danger, and I have learned over years in the wilderness to trust those instincts. I began packing my gear as quickly as I could with shaking hands. My tent, my sleeping bag, my camera equipment, everything was thrown into my truck bed without my usual careful organization. As I was loading the last of my gear, I made the mistake of looking back at the lake. The figure was moving toward me, not walking in a normal way, but moving in a jerky, unnatural gait like stop-motion animation. Its limbs would be in one position, then suddenly in another position, several meters closer, without the smooth transition of normal movement. It was covering ground impossibly fast in these stuttering motions. I threw the last bag into my truck, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The truck was cold, and the engine turned over sluggishly, but it started. I put it in gear and began driving up the trail toward the highway, my headlights illuminating the narrow path through the snow. That is when I saw it in the middle of the trail ahead of me. The figure was now standing directly in my path, about 30 meters in front of my truck. It had somehow gotten ahead of me, though there was no possible way it could have covered that distance from where it had been on the lake. I could see it clearly in my headlights now. It was over 7 feet tall with limbs that looked too thin to support its weight. Its entire form was crystalline ice, and frost vapor was rising off its surface despite the frigid temperature. I did not hesitate. I pressed the accelerator and drove straight toward it, expecting to either pass through some kind of optical illusion or hit whatever this thing actually was. As my truck got within a few meters, the figure moved aside in that same jerky, unnatural motion, and I drove past it. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw it standing in the middle of the trail behind me, turning its head to follow my truck. The movement of its head was too smooth, rotating further than a human neck could turn. I drove as fast as I dared on that narrow trail and did not slow down until I reached the Alaska Highway. Once on the main road, I drove straight to Haines Junction and pulled into the parking lot of the first building I saw that had lights on. I sat there in my truck with the engine running and the heat blasting, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were still shaking, and I felt nauseated with fear. The next morning, I went to the Parks Canada office in Haines Junction and asked about the area where I had been camping. I did not tell them the full story, just that I had seen something unusual and wanted to know if there were any local legends or historical accounts of strange sightings near Kluane Lake. The ranger I spoke with became very serious and asked me to describe what I had seen. When I did, she nodded slowly and told me I was not the first person to report seeing what locals call the Frozen Man or the Ice Walker. She explained that there have been sightings going back to the 1940s of a humanoid figure covered in ice that appears on Kluane Lake during the coldest parts of winter. Multiple witnesses over the decades have described the same characteristics: the unnatural proportions, the jerky movement, the appearance of being made from solid ice. Some indigenous elders from the area say it is a spirit of the lake that manifests during the deep cold, and that it is drawn to people who are alone on the ice at night. No one has ever been harmed directly, but several people who encountered it have disappeared in the area under unclear circumstances. The ranger told me that Parks Canada does not officially acknowledge these reports, but staff members are aware of them, and they try to discourage solo winter camping in that specific area without being too explicit about why. She said I was smart to leave when I did, and that I should consider myself fortunate. She also asked me to keep quiet about the experience because they do not want to create panic or attract people who might seek out the entity deliberately. I spent hours online researching similar phenomena and found scattered accounts from around the world of entities described as ice beings or frozen humanoids in extremely cold regions, but nothing I found provided a satisfactory explanation for what I encountered. I have tried to rationalize it as some kind of hallucination brought on by the cold or altitude, but I know what I saw was real. My camera equipment recorded time-stamped photos that show gaps where I stopped photographing to pack and flee, which matches my memory of the timeline. I have continued my photography work, but I no longer do solo trips in isolated winter locations. I always bring a partner now, and I refuse all assignments near Kluane Lake during winter. Other photographers I have shared the story with have told me they have felt watched or uneasy in that area, but never saw anything concrete. One told me he once found humanoid tracks on the ice that were too large to be human and appeared to have no clear beginning or end, like whatever made them had materialized on the ice and then vanished. I do not know what I encountered that night on Kluane Lake. Whether it was some unknown creature, a supernatural entity, or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I know it was real, and I know it was aware of me. The way it moved closer, the way it positioned itself in my path, the way it turned its head to watch me drive away. It was not random or natural. It was deliberate and intelligent, and that terrifies me more than anything else. The wilderness I once saw as beautiful and peaceful now feels like it holds things we were never meant to encounter, and I will never feel completely safe in it again. I am a woman in my mid-20s, and this happened to me last summer in 2024, and it has left me with questions that will never be answered, and a terror of going underground that I cannot shake. I know how impossible this sounds, and I have been examined by multiple medical professionals who cannot provide any satisfactory explanation for what occurred. I am a geologist by training, and I approach problems methodically and rationally. But what happened to me at the Faro mine site defies every logical framework I possess. I have gaps in my memory that span an entire week, and the evidence suggests I was doing things during that time that should have killed me. It started when I was hired by an environmental consulting firm to conduct a site survey at the abandoned Faro mine. For those unfamiliar, the Faro mine is located approximately 380 kilometers northeast of Whitehorse and was once the largest open-pit lead zinc mine in the world. It closed in 1998 and is now the site of one of the most complex mine remediation projects in Canada. The site has a 25 square kilometer footprint with 70 million tons of tailings and 320 million tons of waste rock that continue to produce acid drainage. My job was to survey specific areas of the underground workings to assess structural stability and contamination levels for the ongoing remediation planning. I arrived in the town of Faro on a Sunday evening in early July. The town itself has a population of around 350 people, down from over 2,000 during the mine's operational years. It has an eerie feeling of abandonment, with empty houses and closed businesses serving as reminders of its former prosperity. I checked into the town's only motel, a small place with about a dozen rooms, and prepared my equipment for the week ahead. I planned to begin my fieldwork Monday morning and spend the entire week collecting data and samples from various locations around the mine site. I remember Monday morning very clearly. I woke up at 6:30, had breakfast at the motel restaurant, and drove the 15 kilometers to the mine site. The scale of the place is staggering when you first see it. The open pit is enormous, and the waste rock piles look like mountains. I signed in with the site security office, went through the safety briefing, and was given access to the areas I needed to survey. The plan was to spend Monday mapping surface features and reviewing access points to the underground sections I would need to enter later in the week. That is the last clear memory I have until the following Monday. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my motel room and sunlight was streaming through the window. I looked at my phone and the date showed it was Monday again. Monday, July 15th. A full week had passed. I stared at the screen in confusion, certain there must be some mistake. I checked my laptop, the television, every clock in the room. They all confirmed the same date. 7 days had vanished from my memory like they had never happened. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to recall anything from the past week. Had I been in an accident? Had I been sick? But I felt physically fine. I was wearing clean clothes and sitting in my motel room as if everything was normal. I checked my belongings and nothing seemed missing. My wallet, my keys, my equipment, everything was where it should be. But I had absolutely no memory of 6 full days of my life. I immediately went to the motel office and asked the clerk whether I had been around during the past week. She looked at me strangely and said yes. I had been coming and going every day, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. She said I had seemed fine, maybe a bit tired, but nothing unusual. I asked whether I had said anything about feeling sick or having problems, and she said no. I'd barely spoken to anyone all week. I got in my truck and drove to the mine site, trying to reconstruct what I might have been doing for the past week. When I arrived at the security office, the guard greeted me by name and mentioned that I had been putting in long hours. I asked him to check the sign-in logs for the past week. According to the records, I had arrived at the site every morning between 7:00 and 7:30, and I had signed out every evening between 9:00 and 11:00. The log showed I had been accessing multiple areas of the underground workings, including sections that were marked as dangerous and off-limits for solo access. I felt sick looking at those logs. I had no memory of any of it. The guard showed me my signatures in the logbook and they were definitely mine. He said I had been very focused and had declined offers from other workers to join me for lunch or coffee. He mentioned that a few people had commented I seemed distant and preoccupied, but everyone assumed I was just intensely concentrated on my work. I went back to my truck and checked my equipment. My GPS unit had recorded hundreds of waypoints over the past week, showing my movements throughout the mine site. I had traveled extensively underground, covering areas I had only planned to briefly survey. When I downloaded the data, I saw that I had gone more than 40 kilometers into the underground tunnel systems, far deeper than any legitimate reason would justify. Some of the locations were in areas that had been sealed off decades ago due to instability and contamination. Then I checked my camera. There were over 800 photos on the memory card that I had no recollection of taking. I sat in my truck scrolling through them with increasing horror. The photos showed me in tunnels deep underground, my headlamp illuminating rock walls and old equipment. But there were photos that made no sense. In dozens of them, there were dark figures visible in the background behind me, humanoid shapes standing in the shadows of the tunnels, partially visible at the edge of the light. In some photos, they were close, just a few meters behind me. In others, they appeared to be following me deeper into the darkness. My hands were shaking as I continued through the photos. In several images, I could see my own arm extended, suggesting I had taken selfies. But my expression in these photos was wrong. My face was blank. My eyes looked distant and unfocused, like I was not fully present. In one particularly disturbing photo, I was standing in front of a tunnel entrance that had been barricaded with chains and warning signs. The chains had been cut and pushed aside, and I was posed in the entrance as if I was about to enter. I immediately went back to the security office and told them I needed to report a serious safety incident. I explained that according to my GPS data, I had accessed prohibited areas, and I had no memory of doing so. The site manager was called, and when I showed him the data and photos, his face went pale. He said it was impossible that I could have gone into some of those areas without specialized equipment and without triggering alarm systems. Some of the tunnels I had apparently explored had been sealed for environmental containment, and accessing them would require cutting through multiple barriers. They assembled a team to verify my GPS data by physically checking some of the locations I had supposedly visited. What they found was even more disturbing. The barriers I had apparently breached showed no signs of tampering. The sealed entrances were intact, but inside some of the accessible tunnels, they found my boot prints in the dust, proving I had been there. More troublingly, they found evidence that someone had been excavating in areas that had not been touched in decades. Fresh digging marks, recently moved rocks, and disturbed sediment in places where no authorized work had been scheduled. I was taken to the health clinic in Faro, where a nurse practitioner examined me. Physically, I appeared healthy, but blood tests revealed elevated levels of lead, zinc, and other heavy metals, consistent with significant exposure to mine tailings and contaminated sediments. My hands and fingernails were packed with dirt, despite the fact that I had showered that morning, suggesting I had been handling contaminated materials extensively. I also showed signs of mild hypothermia, which made no sense given the warm summer weather. The nurse asked me detailed questions about my mental state, whether I had any history of seizures, blackouts, or dissociative episodes. I told her I had never experienced anything like this in my life. She recommended I be transported to Whitehorse for more comprehensive medical evaluation, including brain scans to rule out neurological issues. I agreed immediately because I was terrified that something was seriously wrong with me. In Whitehorse, I underwent a full medical workup, including MRI, EEG, and extensive psychological evaluation. All the tests came back normal. There was no evidence of brain injury, seizure activity, or any physical cause for my amnesia. The psychologist I spoke with raised the possibility of a dissociative fugue state, which is a rare condition where someone loses awareness of their identity and actions, sometimes for extended periods. But he admitted that the circumstances of my case did not fit the typical pattern, particularly the evidence that I had been functioning at a high level and completing complex tasks during the missing time. What disturbed the medical team most was the evidence of toxic exposure. The levels of contamination in my system indicated I had spent significant time in highly polluted areas without proper protective equipment, and I had likely been handling tailings materials directly with my bare hands. They could not explain why I would have done this, or why I showed no signs of acute poisoning despite exposure levels that should have made me seriously ill. The environmental consulting firm I worked for was understandably alarmed by the situation. They conducted their own investigation and concluded that something highly unusual had occurred, but could not determine what. They reviewed all my prior work and found no previous concerns about my judgment or safety practices. The mine remediation project management decided to restrict access to certain areas of the site and recommended enhanced security measures. But they never publicly disclosed the details of what happened to me. I spent weeks trying to understand what occurred during those missing days. I reviewed every photo, every GPS point, every piece of data I had collected. The more I looked, the less sense it made. According to the GPS tracks, I'd traveled distances underground that would have taken many hours of walking. Yet the timeline of my sign-in and sign-out records suggested I could not have covered those distances in the available time. The photos showed me in locations that should have been inaccessible, and the mysterious figures in the backgrounds were never explained. Analysis of the images confirmed they were not artifacts or equipment errors. Something was actually there in those tunnels with me. The local RCMP opened an investigation, but eventually closed it as unexplained. No criminal activity was suspected, and I had not technically violated any laws since I had proper authorization to be on the site. But they recommended I not return to Faro or the mine site, and I agreed without hesitation. The case was added to a file of unusual incidents associated with the mine over the years. Apparently, I was not the first person to report strange experiences there. I quit my job with the consulting firm and changed career paths entirely. I cannot work around mines anymore, especially underground environments. I have recurring nightmares about those dark tunnels and the figures standing in the shadows behind me. I wonder what I was doing during those lost days, who or what I encountered down there in the darkness, and what would have happened if I had continued deeper into those abandoned passages. The worst part is not knowing. My mind protects me from whatever happened by keeping those memories locked away, but that protection feels more like a curse. I know I went somewhere I should not have gone, saw something I should not have seen, or did something I cannot allow myself to remember. And I fear that someday, those missing memories will return, and I will wish they had stayed buried in the dark where they belong. I'm a man in my early 50s, and this happened to me in the fall of 2023, and it still haunts my dreams every single night. I have been a bush pilot for over 25 years, flying supplies to remote mining operations and exploration camps throughout the Yukon and northern British Columbia. I thought I had seen everything the northern wilderness had to offer, but what I discovered near Kino City has fundamentally altered my understanding of what is possible. I am sharing this because the government put a non-disclosure agreement in front of me, and while I cannot reveal certain details, I need someone to know that there are things happening in the remote areas of this territory that defy explanation. Kino City is a tiny hamlet about 70 kilometers north of Mayo, nestled in mountains that were once home to some of the richest silver deposits in Canada. The town itself has maybe 15 year-round residents, but during the summer months, the population swells with tourists and seasonal workers. I had been contracted to supply a small exploration crew working a claim about 30 kilometers beyond Kino City, accessible only by an old mining road that dated back to the 1920s. The crew was testing for silver and lead deposits using modern techniques, and my job was to fly in supplies and equipment every 10 days. I had made 3 successful supply runs in September without incident. The crew consisted of 4 men who were professional and experienced. The camp boss was a geologist named William, who I had worked with before on other projects. He ran a tight operation and always had his radio schedule organized down to the minute. When I flew in on September 28th for the 4th supply run, William met me at the landing strip as usual, and we went through the supply checklist together. Everything seemed normal during that visit. The crew had been making good progress, and William showed me some core samples that looked promising. I stayed for about an hour, had coffee with the crew, and flew back to Mayo. We agreed on the next supply date for October 8th, and I reminded William to do his daily radio check-ins with the base office as per contract requirements. On October 1st, the base office contacted me to say that William had missed his scheduled radio call that morning. This was unusual but not alarming. Equipment failures happen in remote camps, but when he missed the evening call as well, and then missed both calls on October 2nd, the company started to worry. By October 3rd, with still no contact, they asked me to fly out to the camp and investigate. I took off from Mayo early on the morning of October 4th. The weather was clear and cold, with fresh snow dusting the mountains. The flight took about 45 minutes, and as I approached the camp location, everything looked normal from the air. I could see the tents, the equipment, the trucks. No signs of fire or obvious disaster. I landed on the strip and immediately noticed how quiet it was. No one came out to meet me, which was completely out of character. I walked toward the camp, calling out for William and the crew. When I reached the main tent where they took their meals, I found food still laid out on the table. Plates with half-eaten breakfasts, cups of coffee that had long gone cold. It looked like everyone had simply stood up mid-meal and walked away. I checked the sleeping tents and found sleeping bags and personal belongings undisturbed. Wallets, phones, even medications were still there. No one packs up and leaves without those items. I searched the entire camp area and found no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of an accident or attack. The equipment was all operational. The generator was running. The radio was functioning perfectly when I tested it, but 4 grown men had vanished without a trace. Then I found the trail camera. William had mentioned during my last visit that they had set up a wildlife camera on a tree near camp to document any bears or other animals that might be approaching. I located the camera and pulled the memory card. Back at the main tent, I loaded the images onto my laptop. What I saw on that screen made my blood run cold. The camera had captured the crew leaving camp on the night of October 1st at approximately 2:47 in the morning. All 4 men were walking single file away from camp into the forest, heading northwest toward the old mine workings. But the way they were moving was wrong. They were walking in perfect synchronization like a drill formation. Their arms swung at identical angles, their steps matched perfectly, and their heads were held at the same rigid position. It looked choreographed, but there was no reason for it. More disturbing was the footage from a few minutes earlier. The camera had captured all 4 men emerging from their tents at the exact same moment, at 2:43 in the morning. They moved to the center of camp, formed a line, and began walking. Not a single one looked around, not a single one spoke or gestured. They just walked into the forest like they were being marched by an invisible force. I played through the rest of the footage. The camera continued recording until its battery died around noon on October 2nd, but no one had returned to camp. I grabbed the camera, locked my plane, and decided to follow the direction the men had walked. I brought my satellite phone, my GPS, my survival kit, and the pistol I carry for bear protection. The forest floor was covered in fresh snow, but I could still make out a trail where vegetation had been disturbed. The path led northwest through dense spruce and pine, gradually climbing toward a ridgeline where I knew old mine shafts were located. As I walked, I started finding personal items scattered along the trail. First a jacket, then a boot, then a watch. The items were spaced progressively farther apart, like the men had been shedding their belongings as they walked deeper into the wilderness. About 2 kilometers from camp, I found William's radio. It was lying in the middle of the trail, smashed, as if someone had thrown it down with force. Another kilometer beyond that, I found more clothing items in one of the men's backpacks, empty except for a notebook. I opened the notebook and found the final entry was dated September 30th. It was gibberish, repeated phrases written over and over. We hear it calling from below, and the old mine wants us to come home, and we must go deeper, we must go deeper, we must go deeper. The trail led me to a canyon area where multiple old mine shafts dotted the hillside. These were not the modern exploration sites the crew had been working. These were abandoned workings from the 1920s, long sealed or collapsed, and extremely dangerous. At the largest entrance, I found signs of recent digging. Someone had been excavating the collapsed entrance, moving rocks and timber to create an opening large enough for a person to crawl through. I shone my flashlight into the opening and called out for William and the crew. My voice echoed back, but there was no response. I could see that the tunnel descended steeply into darkness. The rational part of my brain told me not to go in alone, that I needed to call for help. But I had to know if the men were down there, possibly injured and waiting for rescue. I crawled through the opening and began making my way down the tunnel. The air smelled of wet rock and decay. The tunnel walls showed signs of age, with old timber supports that looked ready to collapse. After about 50 meters, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam swept across the space, and I saw something that made me freeze. The 4 men were there, or what was left of them. They were lying in a circle in the center of the chamber, positioned like spokes of a wheel, but they were not moving. And from the condition of their bodies, they had been dead for at least 2 days. The temperature in the mine was just above freezing, but the bodies showed signs of hypothermia and exposure. More disturbing was the fact that they were lying in perfect formation with their hands clasped together, forming a connected circle. I approached slowly, checking for any signs of life, but there were none. I noticed that their faces all wore the same expression, peaceful and almost serene, despite what must have been a terrifying death. Around them, on the ground, were symbols scratched into the dirt, patterns that looked almost ritualistic. In the center of the circle was a deep shaft that descended even further underground, and from somewhere far below I could hear water dripping. I took photos with my phone as evidence, marked the location on my GPS, and got out of that mine as fast as I could. I ran back to camp, called the authorities on my satellite phone, and waited for them to arrive. The RCMP came by helicopter along with search and rescue teams. I showed them the footage from the trail camera and guided them to the mine location. The investigation that followed was extensive, but the conclusions were vague. The official determination was that the crew had succumbed to some kind of group psychosis, possibly brought on by carbon monoxide exposure or contamination from the mine environment. They theorized that the men had been affected by gases seeping from the old workings, causing hallucinations and irrational behavior that led them to walk into the wilderness and enter the dangerous mine shaft where they perished from exposure. But that explanation does not account for everything I saw. The synchronized movement, the ritualistic positioning of their bodies, the symbols on the ground, and most troubling of all, the fact that the notebook showed signs of compulsion days before they died. Something in or around those old mines had called to them, and they had answered. The company shut down the exploration project permanently, and the area was designated as contaminated and off-limits. I was required to sign documents agreeing not to publicly discuss certain aspects of what I found. The families of the deceased were compensated and told that their loved ones died in a tragic accident related to toxic exposure. The mine entrances in that area were sealed with concrete and steel, and warning signs were posted throughout the region. But I know there is more to the story than the official version. I have spoken quietly with indigenous elders from the region who told me that those old mine areas have always been considered spiritually dangerous. They said that in the old stories, there are places where the earth itself can call to people, drawing them underground, never to return. They said the miners from the 1920s knew about it, and that there were disappearances back then too that were never explained. I transferred my operating base away from Mayo, and I refuse any contracts that involve flying near Kino City. Other pilots I have spoken to in confidence have told me about strange experiences in that region, about feeling compelled to land in areas where there are no landing strips, about hearing voices on their radio frequencies that cannot be explained. Something is out there in those old mining districts, something that predates the mines themselves, and I pray that the concrete and steel will be enough to keep it contained. I am a woman in my late 30s, and this happened to me last winter in 2024, and it has left me questioning the nature of reality itself. I understand how absurd this sounds, and I have spent months trying to rationalize what I experienced, but there is no logical explanation that fits all the facts. I am an anthropologist by profession, and I have spent my career studying cultures with a rational scientific approach. But what happened to me in Old Crow has challenged every assumption I held about how the world works. I can talk about it now because I need to tell someone, even if they think I have lost my mind. It started when I received funding to visit Old Crow to document traditional Vuntut Gwich'in practices and oral histories. Old Crow is the northernmost community in the Yukon, located about 128 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle at the confluence of the Crow and Porcupine rivers. It is a fly-in community with no road access, home to approximately 300 people, almost all of whom are members of the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation. The isolation and strong cultural traditions of the community made it an ideal location for my research on traditional knowledge systems and cultural continuity. I arrived in Old Crow in early February when the temperature was consistently below minus 30 degrees, and daylight lasted only a few hours each day. The community welcomed me, and I was given permission to conduct interviews with several elders who were willing to share their knowledge. I rented a small cabin on the outskirts of the village and settled in for what I planned would be a month-long stay. During my first week, I spent my days conducting formal interviews and my evenings transcribing and organizing my notes. The elders I spoke with were generous with their time and knowledge, sharing stories about traditional hunting practices, seasonal migration patterns, and the spiritual beliefs that connected the Vuntut Gwich'in to the land. One recurring theme in many of the conversations was the importance of respecting certain places and not disturbing sites that held spiritual significance. One elderly man, whose name I will not use out of respect for his privacy, warned me specifically not to visit an old trading post that stood about 5 kilometers outside the village. He said the building had been abandoned for decades and that there was something wrong with it. When I pressed him for details, he became reluctant to elaborate. He only said that people who went there sometimes experienced strange things, and that the building existed in a way that was not quite right. I assumed he was speaking metaphorically about the building's historical significance, or perhaps about contamination issues. My academic curiosity got the better of me. I'd seen references to trading posts in the historical records of the area, and I thought photographing and documenting an abandoned post might add valuable context to my research. On a relatively warm day when the temperature was only minus 15, I decided to snowmobile out to the location the elder had mentioned. Several people in the community noticed me leaving and asked where I was going. When I told them, they looked troubled and advised against it, but I assured them I would be careful and would not disturb anything. The ride took about 20 minutes across the frozen landscape. The trading post was easy to find, a weathered wooden structure standing alone on a slight rise overlooking a bend in the Porcupine River. As I approached, I was struck by how well preserved it appeared. The building looked old, but not ruined. The roof was intact, the walls were straight, and there was even glass in most of the windows, for a building that had supposedly been abandoned for decades in this harsh climate. It seemed remarkably stable. I parked my snowmobile and approached on foot. The door was not locked, and it opened easily when I pushed. The interior took my breath away. The trading post looked like it was still in operation. The shelves were stocked with goods, canned foods, dry goods, tools, and supplies, all neatly arranged. There was a counter with an old-fashioned cash register, and behind the counter were shelves of tobacco, ammunition, and other items. A calendar hung on the wall showing the month of August 1965. The level of preservation was impossible. These items should have been covered in decades of dust, rusted, rotted, or taken by scavengers and souvenir hunters, but everything looked fresh, like the store had closed yesterday for the night and would reopen in the morning. I pulled out my camera and began taking photographs, documenting the shelves and the items. I picked up a can of soup, and the label was not faded. The can showed no signs of rust or age. As I was examining the items, I heard footsteps on the floor above me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. Then a voice called down from upstairs, a man's voice, gravelly and irritated. "Shop's closed. Come back tomorrow." The voice sounded completely real, not muffled by distance or age, but clear and present, as if the speaker was just a few feet away. Every instinct told me to run. I dropped the can I was holding and bolted for the door. I did not look back, did not try to see who or what was upstairs. I ran to my snowmobile, started it with shaking hands, and drove back to the village as fast as the machine would go. My heart was pounding, and I felt a deep, primal fear that I had intruded somewhere I absolutely should not have been. When I reached the village, I went directly to the home of the elder who had warned me. He took one look at my face and invited me inside. I told him what I had seen, describing the stocked shelves, the fresh-looking goods, and the voice I had heard. He listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said I had been fortunate to leave when I did. He explained that the trading post I had entered was not exactly the abandoned building that existed in the present. According to the knowledge passed down through generations, that particular location existed in two times simultaneously. The physical structure stood in the present as a collapsed and rotted ruin, but the past version of the building, from when it was operational in the 1960s, also existed at the same spot. Sometimes, people would enter what they thought was the old ruin and find themselves in the functioning trading post from decades ago. He said that the man whose voice I heard was the original trader who ran the post. His name was Thomas, and he had disappeared in 1965 under mysterious circumstances. The trading post had closed that summer, and when people from the community went to check on Thomas, they found the building locked up and him gone. His truck was still there. His personal belongings were in his living quarters upstairs, but Thomas himself had vanished. No trace of him was ever found, and the mystery was never solved. According to the elder, Thomas never left. He was still there, trapped in the building in some kind of loop or pocket of time that repeated endlessly. People who entered the building when it manifested as the operational trading post from 1965 would sometimes encounter Thomas. He would always say the same thing, that the shop was closed and to come back tomorrow. The elder warned me not to go back, because those who stayed too long in the building or who went upstairs to confront Thomas would sometimes become lost in the same time loop. I thought he was telling me a traditional story or a metaphor, until I insisted we return to the trading post together so I could show him the photographs I had taken. He reluctantly agreed, and the next day we snowmobiled back to the location. What I saw when we arrived shattered my understanding of reality. The building was a ruin. The roof had collapsed, the walls were partially fallen, and the structure was clearly uninhabitable and had been for many years. The door hung off its hinges, and inside was nothing but rotted timber, snowdrifts, and debris. There were no shelves, no goods, no functioning interior whatsoever. It was exactly what an abandoned trading post that had stood empty for 60 years should look like. I was speechless. I knew what I had seen the day before. I had been inside a fully intact stocked trading post. I had touched the items on the shelves. I had heard a voice, but now I was looking at a building that could not possibly have been what I experienced. The elder watched my reaction and said quietly that this was why people were warned to stay away. When I returned to my cabin, I immediately checked the photographs I had taken inside the trading post. The photos existed on my camera's memory card, and they showed exactly what I had seen. The stocked shelves, the intact interior, the calendar showing August 1965. But when I went to download them to my laptop, something strange happened. The files corrupted during the transfer. Every single photograph from inside the trading post became unreadable, showing only error messages when I tried to open them. Photographs I had taken before and after the trading post visit transferred perfectly. Only the images from inside the building were destroyed. I spent the rest of my time in Old Crow researching what I had experienced. I spoke with other community members who admitted they had heard similar stories or had their own strange experiences near the trading post. One woman told me her father had entered the building in the 1980s and found it fully stocked and operational. He had spoken with Thomas, who told him the shop was closed. When her father returned the next day with other people, the building was a ruin and always had been. I found archival records at the community office that confirmed the basic facts. There had been a trading post at that location operated by a man named Thomas Hewitt from 1958 to 1965. He had disappeared in August 1965, and despite an RCMP investigation, no trace of him was found. The building had been abandoned and gradually deteriorated over the decades, but the records could not explain why some people experienced the building as it had been in 1965. I have tried to research similar phenomena, what some parapsychologists call time slips or temporal anomalies. There are documented cases from around the world of people claiming to have briefly experienced different time periods, but these accounts are always controversial and disputed. The difference with my experience is that multiple people over multiple decades have experienced the same phenomenon at the same location, which suggests something more than individual hallucination or misperception. The most disturbing aspect came after I left Old Crow. For weeks after returning home, I would receive phone calls on my cell phone. The calls would show no caller ID, and when I answered, there would be silence, followed by a gravelly male voice saying, "Shop's closed. Come back tomorrow." Then the line would go dead. These calls came at random times, sometimes in the middle of the night. I changed my phone number, and the calls stopped, but I still sometimes wake up convinced I can hear that voice in my apartment. I have also experienced strange dreams where I am back at the trading post, but this time I go upstairs. In the dreams, I find Thomas sitting at a desk in a small room, writing in a ledger. He looks up at me and says, "You should not have come here. Now you are part of it too." I wake from these dreams, feeling disoriented and confused about what year it is. I abandoned my research project. I could not complete the work knowing that I had experienced something that fundamentally challenged the scientific frameworks I had spent my career building. How do you write an academic paper about traditional knowledge when you have experienced something that suggests our understanding of time and reality is incomplete? I took a leave of absence from my university position, and I have been trying to process what happened. The elder in Old Crow told me that the land remembers things that happen on it, and that some places hold memories so strongly that they can replay them. He said that Thomas is still in that trading post, still living August 1965, unaware that 60 years have passed in the world outside. and according to the elder, anyone who stays too long in the building risks becoming trapped in the same loop, forever repeating the same moments while the world moves on without them. I do not know if I believe in ghosts or temporal anomalies or dimensional pockets, but I know what I saw and experienced. I entered a building that existed simultaneously in 2 different times, and I encountered something or someone that should not have been possible. The photographs that corrupted, the voice on my phone, and the dreams that continue to haunt me all suggest that my brief visit to that trading post created a connection that I cannot fully sever. I will never return to Old Crow, not because I did not love the community or the work I was doing, but because I fear what might happen if I went back to that trading post. Part of me worries that if I entered the building again, I might find it fully stocked and operational, and if I went upstairs this time, I might meet Thomas face to face, and I am terrified that if that happens, I might not find my way back to 2024. I am a man in my mid-40s, and this happened to me in the summer of 2023, and it has haunted me every day since. I am an RCMP officer, and I have seen disturbing things in my career, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered in Beaver Creek during the summer solstice. I have been advised not to speak publicly about certain details of this case, but I feel compelled to share what I know because the pattern continues, and people deserve to be warned. I can talk about it now because I have transferred to a different detachment, and I no longer patrol that area, but I still wake up at night thinking about what happened to those people. I was stationed at the RCMP detachment in Beaver Creek, Canada's westernmost community, located just 28 kilometers from the Alaska border. Beaver Creek is tiny, with a population of around 100 people, mostly members of the White River First Nation and workers at the Border Services Station. The detachment usually handles routine matters like traffic enforcement, border-related issues, and the occasional domestic dispute. It is isolated and quiet, exactly the kind of posting where you do not expect to encounter cases that defy explanation. On June 21st, 2023, the day of the summer solstice, I received a call around 9:30 in the morning from the manager at one of the local motels. A couple who had checked in 2 days earlier had not checked out as scheduled, and their RV was still in the parking lot with the door standing open. The manager had knocked and called out but received no response. She was concerned because their belongings were still inside and there was food cooking on the stove when she looked through the door. I drove to the motel immediately. The RV was a newer model, well maintained with British Columbia plates. When I approached, I could smell something burning from inside. The door was indeed wide open, and I called out several times before entering. Inside, I found a pot of oatmeal that had boiled dry on the stove, the bottom of the pot scorched black. Coffee had been brewed, and 2 cups were set out on the table. Personal items were scattered around, phones charging, wallets on the counter. Everything indicating that the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return immediately. I checked the motel registration and confirmed the couple's names. Michael and Lisa, both in their mid-50s from Vancouver. They were traveling the Alaska Highway on vacation. I called their emergency contacts listed on the registration and learned that the couple had called family members the previous evening and mentioned they were planning to visit a wildlife viewing area the next morning before continuing their journey. Nothing in the conversation had suggested any problems or concerns. I expanded my search to the surrounding area and discovered that the couple's dog, a medium-sized golden retriever, was tied to a post near the RV, extremely agitated and barking continuously. The dog had water but appeared distressed. This detail troubled me because people do not leave their pets tied up and then vanish without explanation. I contacted the Parks Canada Warden Service and organized a search. By early afternoon, a team was assembled to check the wildlife viewing areas and trails near Beaver Creek. About 5 kilometers north of the community, we found a trail camera that had been installed by Parks Canada to monitor caribou movement. I requested the footage be pulled immediately. What we saw on that camera has never been publicly released, but it has become the central piece of evidence in a case that remains officially unsolved. The footage showed Michael and Lisa arriving at the wildlife crossing area at approximately 11:00 p.m. on June 20th. This timing struck me as odd because it was well past sunset, though during the solstice period in the Yukon, there is still significant twilight even at 11 p.m. The couple parked their vehicle and walked toward the forest edge. Their movements were synchronized in a way that seemed unnatural. They walked side by side in perfect step, both looking straight ahead, with identical posture and gait. Their dog was with them initially, running ahead and circling back as dogs do. But as the couple approached the tree line, the dog stopped abruptly. You could see in the footage that the dog refused to follow them further. It pulled against the leash, planted its feet, and even tried to pull them back. Michael unclipped the leash from the dog's collar without looking at the animal, and he and Lisa continued walking into the forest. The dog watched them go and then ran back toward the parking area. The camera captured them, walking in a straight line into the forest, never looking around, never speaking to each other, moving with that same eerie synchronization. They disappeared into the trees and did not return. The camera continued recording through the night and into the morning, but Michael and Lisa never came back out. We organized an extensive search operation. Search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, helicopters, everything available. The dogs picked up the couple's scent and followed it deep into a remote canyon area about 8 kilometers from where they had entered the forest. The terrain there is extremely rugged, with steep cliffs and dense vegetation. The scent trail led to the edge of a cliff overlooking a canyon that drops about 150 meters to a rocky stream below. The search teams rappelled down to the canyon floor, expecting to find bodies, but there was nothing. No remains, no clothing, no equipment. The tracking dogs lost the scent entirely at the cliff edge, as if Michael and Lisa had simply vanished into the air. We searched that area for 3 days, covering every possible route they might have taken, but found no trace of them. During the investigation, I interviewed residents of Beaver Creek and members of the White River First Nation. That is when I learned that this was not the first disappearance in that area around the summer solstice. An elderly man told me about a young couple who had disappeared in similar circumstances in 2016, also on June 21st. Their car had been found abandoned at a trailhead, and they were never seen again. The search had turned up nothing. Before that, in 2009, a solo hiker had vanished on the solstice, and records I found in the old files suggested there were disappearances dating back even further. I spoke with an elder from the White River First Nation, who was willing to share traditional knowledge about the area. She told me that the canyon where the scent trail ended has always been considered dangerous, especially during the summer solstice. According to oral history, there is something in that area that calls to people during the longest day of the year, when the sun barely sets and the light has an unusual quality. She described it as a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world becomes thin, and that those who are called often walk willingly to their deaths without understanding what is happening to them. She said that in traditional times, the Athapascan peoples who lived in the area would avoid that canyon entirely around the solstice. There were stories of people who heard voices calling them from the canyon, beautiful singing that promised something wonderful if they would only come closer. Those who followed the voices were never seen again. The elder told me that the land itself has memory, and that something ancient dwells in that canyon, something that hungers during the solstice. I returned to the trail camera footage and studied it frame by frame. What I noticed upon closer examination was deeply disturbing. In several frames visible in the trees beyond where Michael and Lisa were walking, there appeared to be other figures. They were barely visible, like shadows or smudges on the film, but when I enhanced the images, they looked humanoid. The figures seemed to be keeping pace with the couple, moving through the forest parallel to them. in the final frames before Michael and Lisa disappeared into the darkness. These shadow figures appeared to be leading them, walking just ahead. The official investigation concluded that Michael and Lisa had met with misadventure in the wilderness, likely falling from the cliff during a night hike with their bodies swept away by the stream or lost in the dense vegetation. But I know there is more to the story than that explanation. The synchronized walking, the dog's refusal to follow, the total absence of any remains, and most importantly, the pattern of disappearances on the same date over multiple years all point to something that cannot be explained by conventional means. I made a formal recommendation to the RCMP and to Parks Canada that the area be closed to public access during the period surrounding June 21st. My recommendation included historical data on the disappearances and consultation notes from Indigenous elders. The response was bureaucratic inaction. There was concern about the economic impact on tourism, about potential liability if an official warning was issued, and about the lack of concrete evidence for a specific threat. Instead, general warning signs about hazardous terrain were posted, but nothing that would alert visitors to the specific danger during the solstice period. Michael and Lisa's case remains open. Their families continue to hope they will be found, but I know they will not. I have seen the footage, studied the pattern, and heard the stories. Something in that canyon takes people during the summer solstice, has been taking them for generations, and will continue to do so because we refuse to acknowledge what the evidence clearly shows. I requested a transfer from Beaver Creek 6 months after the incident. I could not continue working in an area where I knew people were at risk and where I was powerless to prevent future tragedies. The detachment that replaced me has been briefed on the case but not on the full details of what I learned from the elders. I worry that when June 21st comes around again, someone else will be camping in that area, will hear something calling from the canyon, and will walk willingly into the forest, never to return. The summer solstice is celebrated around the world as a time of light and life. But in that remote corner of the Yukon, it is a time when something ancient awakens, and the boundary between our world and something else becomes dangerously thin. Michael and Lisa were not the first to disappear, and unless serious action is taken, they will not be the last. I share this story in the hope that it reaches someone planning to visit that area during the solstice period. Stay away from the canyons north of Beaver Creek on June 21st. If you hear singing or voices calling to you from the forest, do not follow them. And if you feel a compulsion to walk into the wilderness at night during the solstice, fight it with everything you have, because once you start walking, you will not stop until you have gone too far to ever find your way back. I am a woman in my early 20s, and this happened to me last summer in 2024, and I still cannot close my eyes without seeing their faces looking up at me from the water. I know this will sound like something from a ghost story, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that what I experienced at Bennett Lake was real. I have tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself it was exhaustion or stress or my imagination, but too many other people saw the same things I did. I can talk about it now because I am far away, and because I hope that sharing this might prevent someone else from experiencing what we went through. I was working as a summer camp counselor at a youth camp on the shore of Bennett Lake near Carcross. Carcross is a small community about 75 kilometers south of Whitehorse, situated at the junction of Bennett Lake and Nares Lake. The area is stunning, with mountains rising dramatically from the water and long sandy beaches that are rare in the Yukon. The camp was run by a non-profit organization that brought Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth together for cultural exchange and outdoor education programs. I had been hired as one of 6 counselors for the 8-week summer session. The camp itself was located on a beautiful stretch of beach on the eastern shore of Bennett Lake. We had cabins for the campers, a dining hall, and various activity areas spread across about 5 acres of land. The lake water was cold but clean and one of the main activities was supervised swimming and canoeing. I was responsible for a cabin of 8 girls aged 12 to 14, and I loved the work despite the long hours and challenging conditions. Everything was normal for the first 3 weeks of camp. The kids were enthusiastic, the weather was mostly cooperative, and we had no serious incidents. But in the 4th week, some of the campers started reporting strange things. Several kids mentioned seeing other children playing on the beach at night, which should not have been possible since all campers were accounted for in their cabins after evening activities. When counselors investigated, they found no one on the beach. Then one of the girls in my cabin, a 13-year-old named Emma, came to me visibly shaken after swimming time. She said she had seen children underwater while she was swimming, standing on the bottom of the lake looking up at her. She described them as wearing old-fashioned clothes and having pale, bloated faces. I assumed she had seen rocks or logs that her imagination had transformed in the murky water, and I reassured her that it was nothing to worry about. But over the next few days, more campers reported similar experiences. They described seeing children in the water who would wave at them and beckon them to come deeper. Some said they heard singing coming from the lake at night, children's voices harmonizing in a language that sounded indigenous, but that none of our First Nations campers recognized. The camp director, a woman named Patricia, who had been running the camp for 15 years, seemed troubled by these reports, but told us it was probably just the kids scaring each other with ghost stories. On a Wednesday evening in late July, I had taken a group of 6 campers down to the beach for a supervised evening swim. The water was calm, and the weather was warm, perfect conditions. The girls were playing in the shallows, splashing and laughing, when suddenly one of them started screaming. I ran into the water and found her thrashing and crying, saying that something had grabbed her ankle and tried to pull her under. I got her to shore and checked her leg. There were marks around her ankle, not bruises, but impressions, like small fingers had gripped her tightly. The girl, a 12-year-old named Sophia, was hysterical. She kept saying that a child had grabbed her from below, a girl with long dark hair and white eyes who had smiled at her with too many teeth. I tried to calm her down while the other campers gathered around, all of them clearly frightened. That is when I saw them. In the water about 20 meters from shore, there were children. At least a dozen of them, maybe more. They were standing in water that should have been over their heads, but they were not floating or swimming. They were just standing there, perfectly still, staring at us on the beach. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like something from early 20th century photographs. Long dresses on the girls, plain shirts and pants on the boys. Their skin was pale and their hair hung wet and limp, but the most disturbing thing was their eyes. Even from that distance, I could see that their eyes were completely white, no pupils or irises visible. The campers saw them too. All 6 girls were now huddled behind me, whimpering and crying. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach as the children in the water began to move. They walked toward the beach in perfect unison, still staring at us with those horrible blank eyes. As they got closer, I could see that they were not walking on the lake bottom. They were walking on top of the water, their feet creating small ripples with each step, but never breaking the surface. I grabbed the campers and ran back toward the main camp, yelling for help. Other counselors and staff came running, and when they looked at the lake, they saw them too. The children had stopped at the water's edge, standing in a line along the beach. There were 14 of them, ranging in age from maybe 6 years old to early teens. They stood motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. And then they turned in unison and walked back into the lake, descending beneath the surface until they disappeared. The camp director immediately gathered all the counselors and senior staff for an emergency meeting. Some people wanted to call the RCMP, but Patricia said we needed to talk to someone else first. She made a phone call, and within an hour, an elderly woman arrived at the camp. Her name was Agnes, and she was an elder from the Carcross Tagish First Nation. Patricia explained to us that she had called Agnes because what we had experienced was not something the police could help with. Agnes listened carefully as we described what we had seen. She asked specific questions about how the children looked, what they were wearing, and whether they had tried to communicate. When we mentioned that one had grabbed a camper and tried to pull her deeper, Agnes's face became grave. She told us we were very fortunate that we had all gotten out of the water when we did. She explained that the area around Bennett Lake has a tragic history that few people talk about openly. In the early 1900s, there had been a residential school not far from where our camp was located. The school operated for several decades, and many indigenous children from across the southern Yukon had been forcibly taken from their families and sent there. The conditions at the school were horrific, with widespread abuse, neglect, and disease. Many children died at the school, but the exact number was never properly recorded. Agnes told us that there were stories passed down through families about children from the school who drowned in Bennett Lake. Some of these drownings were ruled accidents, but there were suspicions that children had been punished by being forced into the cold water, or that some children had deliberately drowned themselves trying to escape the school. The bodies of several children were never recovered from the lake. In the decades since the school closed in the 1960s, there have been reports of children's spirits near the water, especially during the summer months. She said that the spirits of these children were angry and traumatized by what had happened to them. They were drawn to other children who came to the lake, and they would try to bring them into the water to join them. Agnes described it as a kind of compulsion born from loneliness and suffering. The spirits did not understand that they were causing harm. They just wanted companionship and to be remembered. Agnes performed a ceremony on the beach that night. She burned sacred medicines and sang traditional songs, speaking to the spirits in her language. She acknowledged their suffering, honored their memory, and asked them respectfully to leave the children at the camp alone. She placed offerings at the water's edge and marked stones with symbols. She told us that the ceremony would help, but that the area would never be completely safe because the trauma that created these spirits was too deep and too recent. The camp director made the difficult decision to cancel the remaining 3 weeks of camp and send all the campers home. We told the parents there had been a safety concern that required immediate closure, but we did not provide details about what had happened. Most of the counselors, including me, left as soon as possible. Only a skeleton crew remained to close down the facilities, but the incidents did not stop. During the final days of closure, staff reported seeing the children on the beach every night. They would emerge from the lake around dusk and stand on the shore until full darkness fell. One counselor, a man named David, reported waking up to find a dripping wet child standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with those white eyes. He packed his belongings and left that same night. I learned later from Patricia that this was not the first time the camp had experienced supernatural activity. There had been incidents in previous years, but never as intense or frightening as what happened in 2024. She said that after consulting with First Nations elders and the organization's board, the decision was made to permanently close the camp at that location. The property has since been transferred to the Carcross Tagish First Nation, and there are plans to create a memorial site to honor the children who died at the residential school. I did some research after I left the camp and found historical records confirming what Agnes had told us. The residential school had operated from 1911 to 1968, and while official records only acknowledge 12 student deaths, interviews with survivors and community members suggested the actual number was much higher. Several of the recorded deaths were listed as drownings, and there were multiple mentions in archival documents of students being punished with cold water or forced to swim in the lake as discipline. What haunts me most is not just what I saw, but what it represents. Those children suffered unimaginable trauma and abuse at the hands of people who were supposed to educate and care for them. They died far from home, separated from their families and culture, and many were never properly mourned or even identified. The fact that their spirits are still trapped at that lake, still trying to reach out to the living, is a testament to how profound and lasting that harm was. I cannot work with children anymore without thinking about those faces in the water. I changed my career plans, and I now work in an office doing administrative work. I avoid lakes and beaches, especially in northern regions. I know rationally that what happened was specific to that place and that history, but I cannot shake the feeling that there are other places like it, other sites of historical trauma, where the suffering was so great that it left permanent scars on the landscape. The experience also taught me how important it is to acknowledge these histories. Agnes told us that part of the reason the spirits were so active was because their deaths had never been properly acknowledged or honored. For decades, the truth about what happened at that residential school was suppressed and denied. The spirits could not rest because their stories had not been told and their suffering had not been recognized. I hope that by sharing this story, I am contributing in some small way to that acknowledgement. Those children existed, they suffered, and they died unjustly. Their spirits deserve to be at peace, and the living deserve to know what happened, so that such horrors are never repeated. I will never forget the children I saw at Bennett Lake, and I will carry their memory with me always, even as I pray they have finally found the peace they were denied in life.